clashes in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip a day after the UN vote on Jerusalem, with Palestinians saying 2 were shot dead on the Gaza border by Israeli forces.
Spanish Prime Minister Mario Rajoy rejects meeting now with ex-Catalan leader Carlos Puigdemont, despite the success of pro-independence parties in Thursday's regional vote.
At Syria peace talks in Astana today, Russia proposes to host a meeting of all the parties in Sochi at the end of January.
And at the White House, President Trump signs off on the Republican tax plan and a $4 billion missile defense bill.
And one of the most influential leaders of the tech industry, Eric Schmidt, says he's stepping down as executive chairman of Google's parent company, Alphabet.
Welcome back to the Rundown. Well, guess what? If you are one of the 64 nations that joined the U.S. in not approving the United Nations resolution condemning President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and that was either by voting against, abstaining, or just being absent from the General Assembly, well, you're going to a party hosted by U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, on January 3rd. But is the vote that the U.S. lost by a wide margin, with 135 nations taking issue with the U.S. on Jerusalem, really reason to celebrate? Did that vote cost the U.S. diplomatic prestige or its role as a Mideast peace broker? Well, we're joined in our New York studio by Jonathan Crystal, a fellow at the World Policy Institute, and in Washington, D.C. by John Sitilides, a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. And I'll start in Washington with you, John, and with that question. Did losing that vote in that manner yesterday cost the United States diplomatic prestige?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I see this as a triple victory for the Trump administration in terms of, first of all, bilateral relations with a number of countries to whom there is the possibility, not so much, I think, a threat of a U.S. cutoff of aid, but leveraging that vote in further discussions about U.S. aid to those countries as a way of extracting greater concessions from a select number of countries that are problematic in terms of U.S. aid. I think also there's the possibility that the Trump administration will decide to withhold part of its annual assessment to the United Nations for, say, certain bodies of the UN, such as the Human Rights Council, where countries such as Cuba and Venezuela and China moralize to the world about human rights. And it's also a very popular issue among the broad American electorate, exposing the UN for amorality and hypocrisy on Israel and other issues.
Jonathan, let me go to you in New York. And this UN General Assembly vote, to a great extent, it was a test for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's diplomatic skills, but it was also a test of President Trump's influence and clout. Looking at the results, 128 nations voting in favor of that motion. Did the president fail?
Sure. Well, the problem here was one of strategy. This resolution was always going to fail. I mean, it was always going to pass. It was going to fail for the U.S. There was nothing that we could have done to change that. And so I'm not quite sure what we gained by making brash statements about cutting off aid and taking names on this when we were always going to lose. And more importantly, this resolution compels us to do nothing. It has no actual impact on us whatsoever. It has no impact on where we do or do not put a U.S. embassy. And this seems to me that diplomacy really is about letting the other guy win when they need to. And we have a lot of allies who voted for this resolution. We can give them an easy victory that costs us nothing. And I'm a little bit confused why we didn't just sort of let it go. So I think we lost only by making it out to be so much more than it really is. And the party thing is more of that. I think that probably a lot of our allies will get over not being invited to a party.
And yet, ahead of that vote, Nikki Haley and the president, of course, both made threats to cut funding from the member states who will vote not to the president's liking. John, back to you in Washington, D.C. To what extent would you say that the Trump administration can follow through and materialize those threats and cut aid to countries who voted in favor of that motion?
Well, again, I don't see any major threat in terms of a serious cut in U.S. aid to countries that play a very vital role in advancing common interests and promoting stability and deterring foes in their particular part of the world, or we are assisting those countries with economic development issues that are vital to domestic political stability. But I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, that Trump considers himself a brilliant negotiator and is looking for every tool to also extract concessions from other countries. So where there are those countries that have taken an out-front role in condemning the U.S. on this particular Jerusalem issue, there may be more intensive discussions behind the scenes as we prepare the budget for aid in the upcoming years and look to see how we're able to extract greater concessions from those countries, keeping in mind that they voted against the United States on this UN vote. And those countries that abstained, I don't think there are any major surprises there, so I don't see any deleterious impact in terms of U.S. aid for those countries. Many of those don't even receive any aid from the United States. They're mostly advanced Western countries. Again, I think the larger issue here is to put countries on notice that the Trump administration has a very different approach to the United Nations, a very different approach to standing up for Israel, and then looking to see where this could be a very important justification for reducing the U.S. budget for UN operations in 2018 and beyond.
Jonathan, let's go back to the issue of the U.S., if it can still play a broker's role in the Mideast peace process. The Palestinians are boycotting the Trump administration. President Abbas is in Paris talking today with President Macron. Is there any possibility of the Trump administration getting their peace efforts back on track?
Well, no, I don't think that there is, but I think it's because of a lot of disingenuousness on the part of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, in reality, if the U.S. did move its embassy to West Jerusalem into an area that no serious person thought would not be part of Israel in a final status talk, it doesn't prejudge any outcome. The substance of what Nikki Haley said about this issue is exactly right. And so there's no reason why this should impact the role that the United States can play. The problem that the United States has here is that we don't actually have a real strategy to bring both sides to the table and forge some sort of agreement. And I think acting petulant and impetuous and sort of throwing a fit about things isn't necessarily going to get it done. And, you know, the biggest problem, I think, with this whole sort of affair, well, the two things. One is that we haven't even moved the embassy at all. It's all sort of much ado about nothing. Trump signed the waiver. It's true that it will take many years to really find a place and move an embassy. But we also could have, with the approval of President Rivlin, bought a house, called it the embassy, and pushed for a symbolic victory. But we haven't even done that. And so, you know, everyone is sort of being disingenuous, from the U.S. To the Palestinian Authority, not to really not to conflate them, but, you know, this is all a lot of show, and I think we should really let people play it out.
Okay. John, it looks to me like you and Jonathan maybe have differing views of what went down there at the United Nations. But let me ask you realistically, is there really any chance of the Trump administration, in your view, moving forward to what President Trump called the ultimate deal? Or has he basically given up now on that part of his strategy?
Oh, I don't think there's any idea that they've given up. As a matter of fact, he's assigned this to his son-in-law. One can argue about Jared Kushner's qualifications, but it's clearly a priority for the Trump administration. But I think they're looking to set some new parameters for negotiations going forward. And the decision by the Trump administration to follow the decisions of Presidents Clinton, Presidents Bush, and Presidents Obama, all to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but to actually implement it, which is what sets Trump apart from his predecessors, I think also forces, especially the Palestinian Authority, but also other Arab parties in the region,
yes,
to recognize the permanence of the Israeli nation state in the region as the basis for any serious negotiations going forward.
Yes, John Sitilides in Washington, D.C., and Jonathan Crystal in New York. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. We ran out of time for this segment. Yeah. We could have carried on.
Certainly.
And we will be coming back in a minute, though. Stay with us on The Rundown. There's more to come.